Hello, friends. Welcome back. It's quite a rainy and windy day, so I feel it's the perfect time to read. We're on to chapter 20 of Rolling Thunder, Seeing More Than Meets the Eye. In January 1971, I was about to wind up my work with Rolling Thunder when I went with Elmer and Alice Green to the University of California Medical Center to hear them give a lecture about Swami Rama and Jack Schwartz. Schwartz is a neuropath who is able to demonstrate self-healing and control of pain and blood flow, and is a consultant to the Greens' research project on voluntary control of internal states at the Menninger Foundation. After the lecture, I met with Pat Schaefer, a friend of Schwartz, who was program director for the upcoming conference on healing to be held by the Association for Humanistic Psychology in San Francisco in May. Schwartz was about to speak at this conference, as were both Elmer and Alice Green. Stanley Krippner, who had invited Rolling Thunder to Council Grove, had suggested that Rolling Thunder would be a valuable speaker at the conference. Pat Schaefer had written Rolling Thunder twice, but had received no answer, and she thought that since I was working with him, I could find out if he would be willing to speak. Rolling Thunder almost never made appointments, and I had doubts about his making a commitment 4 months in advance. I knew he had never spoken before such a general audience. I feared there was a little I could do to help the arrangements, but I agreed to talk to him. Later that evening, I talked with Jack Schwartz over a quiet cup of coffee. Schwartz told me that my association with Rolling Thunder had just begun. He predicted that my work to date was the opening of a door, and that more interesting developments were ahead. I was only mildly surprised by his prediction, but I wondered what would happen to my project with Rolling Thunder in the coming months. A few days later, I returned to Carlin, accompanied by a Japanese friend I had met in San Francisco during the summer. Tsutomu Hayashi hoped to see some natives and get a different view of this country, so many times more vast and varied than his own. I told Hayashi about the tribes who once lived free on this land, about the chiefs and the medicine men and the quiet villages. I related the coming of the white man, the killing of the buffalo and the starvation of the people, the purposeful spreading of smallpox, the broken treaties and the broken promises. I told him about the Bureau of Indian Affairs' claims that Native people are incapable of self-determination. I told him about forced separation of Native families and the chaining of the pinyon trees. This information came as a surprise to him, but he believed it and was interested. Unlike many of my American friends, he felt no personal need to defend or deny these facts. By the time it grew too dark to even see the silhouettes of the giant sage, Hayashi was fatigued from the mountains, the sun, and hearing too much English. He closed his eyes. He could sleep until the brakeman came back to let us out in Carlin. Perhaps the same brakemen I had met before would be working this train. I sat silently for the remaining 2 or 3 hours and looked out the shiny black window. I felt stimulated and I didn't need sleep, so I gazed in the window and watched reflections of the old-fashioned ceiling lights. My mind reflected on 4 questions that I had for Rolling Thunder. I had settled on one of these questions just a few days before with Elmer and Alice Green in San Francisco. On the day after the lecture, I joined them at Dolly Gazzotti's house in Berkeley for a pleasant afternoon of tea, cheese, cookies, and organic vitamin C. Dolly Gazzotti had been keeping a bottle of natural vitamin C tablets in her refrigerator for what she had claimed was a very long time. She rarely used them, yet when someone sneezed and mentioned a cold, she was quick to remember the vitamin C. The bottle was soon on the table as a tea-time conversation piece. While staying with my sister in Berkeley, I had noticed that she used both absorbic acid and natural vitamin C. My sister's theory was that the absorbic acid was probably of some small value. I felt, however, that if absorbic acid had any value at all, its value approached that of natural vitamin C in proportion to its price. At camp, Ann Haberton and Richard Clemmer had taken synthetic vitamins every day that seemed incongruous to me, considering how back to nature they were about everything else. Now the topic had come up again. It was not a new subject for the Greens. Elmer Green said he was not certain that natural and synthetic vitamins were identical, even if chemically the same, because yogic theory implied certain non-chemical differences could exist, essentially a difference in molecules from organic and inorganic sources. I remembered cases the Greens had mentioned in which Jack Schwartz looked at people and apparently saw chemical deficiencies in them. This phenomenon, or talent, had never been tested scientifically. I wondered aloud whether Schwartz might be able to see the difference between a natural vitamin C tablet and a synthetic, and I decided to ask Rolling Thunder about this. At lunch, Elmer Green had reminded me what Jack Schwartz had said about my future and what it would mean if this were true. There had never been any structural plan or program in my relationship with Rolling Thunder. Our association had been an unregulated one, and it was probably for this reason that it had worked. Still, I was an employee of the Menninger Foundation, even though I was now covering my own expenses and voluntarily working on half salary to conserve funds. It was doubtful that this arrangement could last much longer. If I were to continue my association with Rolling Thunder, I would have to go on leave. It was obviously time for me to discuss with Rolling Thunder whether we had more to do. If he had a plan, I was quite willing to manage it. I would ask. Later, I told the Greens and Dolly Gazzotti about Rolling Thunder's confrontation with a young sorcerer, and the healing rituals at Bolinas and Virginia Beach. Everyone was impressed with the involvement of doctors in these instances. Elmer Green thought it would be useful for me to talk to those doctors for validation, documentation, and a follow-up of Rolling Thunder stories, suggesting that Rolling Thunder had perhaps described the events in the hope that I would carry through with the documentation. This was something else I would ask Rolling Thunder about. It looked like this meeting with Rolling Thunder would be more of a business meeting than a visit. I now had 3 important questions for him. Unfortunately, I seldom found it possible to have a discussion with him if I tried to lead the conversation. My first question was whether Rolling Thunder wanted me to continue to be around, whether he had more for me to do and learn. Second, I wanted to remind him that he had mentioned the possibility of documentation when he had told me what he had done at Bolinas and at Virginia Beach, and I wanted to ask him whether he was thinking of this as a project for me. The third question was whether he thought there was a significant difference between natural and synthetic vitamins. I had been meaning to ask him this ever since Anne and Richard and I discussed it at camp some months ago. Now that all of us had just been talking about this again, I wanted to be sure to ask. Alice Green had reminded me the fourth question for Rolling Thunder. I was to ask whether he would be willing to speak in May at the Association for Humanistic Psychology Conference on psychic healing and self-healing. A jog of the train reminded me that Carlin lay ahead, and that I had to think about the order of business. I was coming here for an additional purpose, to close out the Carlin apartment. I would wait on that until I had talked with Rolling Thunder, as our need for the apartment hinged upon possible future work with him. A different brakeman walked through our car. I shook Hayashi. This brakeman looked fat and awkward, and he passed back and forth without even looking at us. I went to find him to remind him that we wanted to be let out in Carlin. He told me it was a fair piece to Carlin. He would let me know when. There was no big panic, he assured me, since the train would sit in Carlin for nearly 30 minutes anyway. When we arrived in Carlin, the air was unbelievably warm and gentle. I had been warning Hayashi how cold it would be. I had wanted to prepare him for the miserable walk from the train to the apartment. I had told him that our hands would be numbed by the freezing cold. Carlin could get colder than Topeka. In January, temperatures usually drop below freezing. Yet it was warm here now, warmer than it had been when we had moved down in the canyon in the fall. The clear, warm night, and especially the surprise of it, elated me. Hayashi seemed equally enchanted. His surprise was looking into the sky and seeing more stars than he had ever seen in Osaka. It was a good time to go to Rolling Thunder's house. I had planned to wait until the morning, but the night was pleasant. Besides, I knew that Rolling Thunder was not expecting me, and I wanted to tell him I was here. If we left our bags at my apartment and then went directly to Rolling Thunder's house, we could call on him before 10 o'clock. It felt right. I would ask for a private meeting and arrange a time. The arrangement of the time might make it easier for me to keep our conversation businesslike. When we reached the apartment, Mrs. Elder let us in. She was happy to see me and had much to say. She seemed to think that I was coming back to stay, but it was too late to tell her I had really planned to close out the apartment and leave Carlin. That would have to wait. With some gifts for Rolling Thunder and Spotted Fawn, we walked through town to the familiar house. He said she was teaching Spotted Fawn how to prepare Japanese dishes, so Hayashi should feel at home. Yasumi could also interpret, since she spoke English rather well. Rolling Thunder seemed to think there was nothing unreasonable about this coincidence. Spotted Fawn brought coffee and sat down with us, and I gave out the gifts I had brought. I had a copy of Last Whole Earth Catalog for Rolling Thunder and the family. I gave Spotted Fawn some incense and a little idle incense burner. This is a lot of work. Of course, the pinyon tree chaining is still an issue, and that fits into everything. But that's not all. There are a lot of doctors, medical doctors and psychiatrists, especially the young ones and the new ones, who are thinking in new ways, entirely different from the old establishment. Some of our people will be working with these people, and they'll be cooperating with us. As I said before, we have knowledge and capabilities that they are going to need. And they have some abilities and techniques that we could learn about too. I would like for you to talk to these doctors in Bolinas and Virginia Beach and get the documentation on what I told you. He paused and squinted. I felt very strange. Perhaps it was coincidence, but it was done as if he knew these were my questions. If you meet these doctors, you'll find them very easy to talk to. And there'll be more like them. They're not intimidated or disturbed by our medicine. They don't have a sense of competition about medicine, and they don't feel threatened. It's not that they understand about native medicine, because these things are new to them. But they're open-minded, and they think like we do in many ways. They would agree with some of the things we've always been saying. Years ago, for example, it would not have been our place to go to your people and tell them to stop using chemical preservatives and synthetic foods. I believe in natural vitamins, he said quietly. He nodded at me. He put down his pipe, lifted a kitten out of his lap, and went into the kitchen and came back carrying as many bottles as his hands could hold. These are the vitamins that we take. These are the ones I like to recommend when I'm asked. I felt a strange sensation along the surface of my skin, especially on my face. It was not surprise or amazement, but more like appreciation. This had happened before, when I was able to participate in some communication or understanding far beyond my own capacity. I felt gratitude. Vitamins are life, a certain life force that can't be synthetically produced. A lot of different things might look the same under a microscope to most people, but there's more to things than meets the eye. There's going to be some way to show that difference, though, so that people can see it, like the difference between the synthetic and natural vitamin C. Some instrument or some system exists, I think, that will show that, and I have a feeling we'll find out what that is and when we can use that too. I have a feeling that's right around the corner. He sat down again and talked about the new doctors and their thinking, the cooperation and mutual endeavor that was to come about the future. Of course, there are many things that some of the old establishment doctors will never learn, no matter how much chance they have to learn. It might be mainly because they don't want to, but then, that's their business. There are other people who understand, or think they do, almost too easy. They say they are anxious to learn and that they want to know about all these things, but yet they don't want to do the discipline and the purification. They don't want to do the work to prepare themselves, so there's the danger of too much being revealed too early. On the other hand, I know there are many people who are ready to learn and looking for a way, as I said before. If these people come together to really learn, doctors and students and workers who have a real purpose, if they are really sincere and not just curious, then they would be willing to speak. The meeting was over. I had nothing to say. There probably would never be a right time to ask how he had known my questions, and all in the order I had prepared them. There would be more to discuss later, but I knew it would work out. Maybe there were no questions, and there never had been any. There was only this eternal orderly arrangement, a constant right time and right place for all things. Hayashi and I stayed in Carlin for a week and the weather was magnificent, crisp and fresh the entire time. One morning, Hayashi got up before sunrise and hiked to the top of the distant hills. He had wanted to walk for hours in the silence and open space, and to see the sun come up behind absolutely nothing but the earth itself. He had many questions about Rolling Thunder, and we talked about medicine, native customs, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Hayashi was intensely interested, but our speech had to be very slow and careful, and each meaningful discussion took hours. We stayed in Carlin for a week, and I arranged to keep my place with Mrs. Elder, and to store my things while I was gone. Hayashi visited with Yasumi. Rolling Thunder and Spotted Eagle were planning to drive to San Francisco, and offered us a ride back with them. But meanwhile, Rolling Thunder was away on a trip for the railroad for several days. We spent time at the house and Spotted Fawn insisted on feeding us every time we were there. One evening, Hayashi and I sat in the living room savoring the smell of supper through the kitchen door. Rolling Thunder was due back and the train was late, so he would be hungry. I spoke to Spotted Fawn in English. Hayashi talked to Yasumi in Japanese. Spotted Eagle listened to rock records in his room, and we waited. When the trains pulled into the station, Spotted Eagle left the music and took the Camaro up the tracks to drive Rolling Thunder home. I wondered how the train could be heard over the sound of the loud rock music, but when it came, Spotted Fawn had somehow known and shouted to Spotted Eagle. I wondered how the train could be heard over the sound of the loud rock music, but when it came, Spotted Fawn had somehow known and shouted to Spotted Eagle. Rolling Thunder came through the door wearing his coveralls and his railroad hat. He had his usual friendly grin and hearty greeting. He put his brakeman's lantern on the table in a deliberate manner and slowly drew his wrist across his forehead. "Looks like maybe we've got something good waiting for us out here," he said, looking toward the kitchen and sniffing the air. Suddenly, he sniffed again very loudly. Then he held his face straight up and moved his nostrils. I wondered whether something was burning. I couldn't notice any smell. Perhaps he was trying to identify every item on the menu. He called the spotted fawn in the kitchen. "Who's all here?" "Just who you see," she answered. "Then who's been here just now? Any strangers been around?" "Not that I know of." He sniffed the air again. "They're outside somewhere," he shouted at Spotted Eagle. Rolling Thunder took a handgun from a drawer and stepped out into the night with Spotted Eagle behind him. I walked to the open doorway and looked. Hayashi looked over my shoulder. Rolling Thunder sniffed again. "I think they're out there in the shed," I heard him whisper. He pointed to the shack behind his house across the road. He waved his arm and Spotted Eagle moved off to the left. The night was dark and still. There was no sound. I couldn't see the shed across the road. Rolling Thunder had moved toward the shed, and I saw his silhouette. I walked out to the road where I could see him more clearly. He moved like a silent shadow. Suddenly, he made a blood-curdling howl that crackled the atmosphere. I felt an electric shock in the back of my head. It flashed across my back and into my chest, causing me to gasp. A sharp crackling noise came from the shed, and then the sound of boots. A figure came rushing towards me, turned suddenly and ran across the road. My eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and I could see Spotted Eagle running off into the distance, and Rolling Thunder standing behind the shed, peering into the night. I looked back toward the house and saw Hayashi still in the doorway. "Did you see anybody?" Rolling Thunder began walking back toward me. "Someone ran across the road right here," I pointed. "I think there were 3 of them," he said. "2 of them ran straight out that way." He looked in the direction where Spotted Eagle had disappeared. "Don't know who they were." We stayed in the road until Spotted Eagle came walking back. "I couldn't see them," he said. "I was way down here when they took off. They were pretty far ahead." "Well, we'll go in and have supper, and then you can go see if you can find out who they were and what they were doing." "I'm going to get another couple of dogs," Rolling Thunder continued as we walked back into the house. "Big ones. And I'm going to have to rig up a string of lights back here." He made a wide arc with his arm. "All the dogs were in the house, or the prowlers would have alerted them. The only dog that never came inside at night was Brandy, but Brandy was dead." Spotted Fawn had put supper on the table. As we sat down to eat, Rolling Thunder told Hayashi what had happened to Brandy. I knew the story, at least the first part. Some time ago, when he visited Berkeley, Rolling Thunder had mentioned that sad news. He had said that someone had come in the night and dragged Brandy off. The other dogs had barked, but the family had gotten used to the barking at night, and no one looked out. Brandy was just a pup. As enormous as he was, he made friends with anyone. He had not made a sound that anyone could hear, but apparently he had not wanted to leave with his strange visitors. For the following morning, Rolling Thunder examined the boardwalk and the road and decided that Brandy had been dragged along his seat to a car across the road. Now Rolling Thunder had told us that the dog's body had been found weeks later. One of Buffalo Horse's friends had seen a dead St. Bernard out on the landing strip near the old mine. Buffalo Horse had gone on to check and found Brandy's decaying body with nearly a dozen bullet holes in it. Rolling Thunder had told the whole story to Hayashi, as Yasumi was not here at the table to interpret. "Do you understand?" I asked Hayashi. "Yes." Do you think you really understand? Asked Rolling Thunder. He added quietly, I don't think I understand it myself. He said nothing more, and our supper was less cheerful than usual. And that is the end of the chapter, my friends. A little bit of a heavy ending, but picks up a bit in the next. Thank you all very much for listening. Take care. Niawa.